Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. Some people still believe talent has an expiration date, that after a certain age we're only meant to watch, never to dazzle again. But what if I told you that a modest-looking elderly lady with calm steps gave a lesson no conservatory would dare include in its curriculum? She was judged, underestimated, and challenged as if she were invisible. But it only took a single moment, a touch on the piano, for her to change everything. The professors thought they were testing her, but they were the ones being tested, and they failed miserably. What you're about to witness isn't just a musical performance. It's one of those stories that leaves chills, about prejudice, hidden talent, and a public reversal that shook the internet. A video went viral. An entire institution bowed in reverence, and a whole generation learned to see differently those they used to overlook. Brace yourself, because this story is about to flip a switch inside you, the kind that never turns off once it's lit. Cecilia had barely stepped into the conservatory when her eyes already carried the calmness of someone who had nothing to prove. But the world, the world loves to test those who don't dress up as success. A group of professors looked her up and down, trying to decode an invisible uniform. They mistook wisdom for servitude, and prejudice, as usual, came disguised as curiosity. Between suppressed laughter and exchanged glances, one of them issued the challenge. "Why don't you try this one, ma'am?" and handed her the most complex sheet music in the room, like offering a trap wrapped in politeness. To an onlooker, it seemed like just another trivial moment, but it hid a deep abyss of judgment. And here's the thing, this doesn't happen only in conservatories. It's the woman in flip-flops walking into a luxury store, the elderly man inquiring about investments and being handed a basic savings pamphlet, the mother attending a school meeting and being mistaken for a janitor. The issue isn't the question, it's the tone, the smirk behind the words, the condescension laced in the challenge. But life, my friend, is an expert at flipping the script at just the right time. And while laughter echoed around the room, Cecilia looked at the sheet music like reuniting with an old friend. She didn't ask for time. She didn't hesitate. She simply walked to the piano like someone who remembers where she came from, even when the world forgets. And this is the precise moment when one of those stories begins, the kind that sticks in your mind forever, especially when the sound of the keys speaks louder than any label. Few knew, or better, no one there imagined, that this quiet lady with slow steps had once captivated audiences in France, Austria, Poland. Cecilia was that rare kind of artist who didn't just play with technique, she played with soul. Her fingers told stories that crossed languages and borders. In the 1970s, critics bowed to her almost spiritual interpretation of Chopin, but time, that old editor of public memory, filed her away as if talent had an expiration date. Life took a turn. The stage became a kitchen. Applause turned into midnight silence while she rocked her children to sleep. In the anonymity of daily chores, Cecilia kept the music alive, even if only in her head. Every pot she scrubbed was a mental symphony. Each trip to the market, a new imaginary composition. So many stories live in these backstage moments of life. Brilliant people who traded the spotlight for responsibility and still remained giants, just out of the spotlight. And the most curious part, true talent never retires. It simply retreats, like an underground river that continues to flow, unseen. Cecilia wasn't any less of a pianist for being away from the piano. On the contrary, the distance sharpened her sensitivity, refined her listening, and gave her something no conservatory can teach, the wisdom to know when to be silent and when to let the music speak for her. And in that moment, what was coming wasn't just a response, it was a revelation. Cecilia sat at the piano like someone returning home after a long journey. Her fingers, though marked by time, quickly remembered the way. It was as if each key knew her name, as if the instrument itself had been waiting for her all those years. The first chords came gently, but with such precision, they took the breath away from even the most skeptical. Within seconds, the room that once reeked of mockery was wrapped in reverent silence. It was the kind of moment you don't rehearse. It just happens, and it changes everything. And what does that scene teach us? That true talent doesn't ask for permission to shine. It doesn't rely on youth or validation. Age only weighs on those who measure worth by calendars. Cecilia proved that the most powerful stories don't die. They simply sleep, waiting for the right time to bloom. And when that happens, no resume, title, or status can compete with the force of a lived truth. What she did wasn't just play, it was unveil. How many times have we hidden ourselves thinking our time had passed? How many people do you know who stopped dancing, painting, writing, teaching, just because someone said it was too late? That's where the biggest mistake lies, believing our gifts age with our skin, when in fact they mature. If something inside you is begging to live again, listen. Cecilia's piano was just an instrument, but the music, that was her soul screaming it wasn't too late. And that auditorium was about to learn that once and for all. When Cecilia played the final note, the sound lingered in the air for a few seconds, as if even the acoustics didn't want to interrupt the miracle. No one moved. It was as if time had frozen out of respect. And then, as if waking from a collective trance, the audience rose in applause, an ovation that sounded more like an apology. Professors who once scoffed were now teary-eyed. What began as a test had become a lesson. What once seemed like a joke had turned into revelation. And there was born another one of those stories that can't be told in words, only in emotions. The headmistress, visibly embarrassed, crossed the room as if walking on thorns. She approached Cecilia with her heart in her hand and her pride tucked away. She apologized, not just for the Prejudice challenge, but for failing to recognize a living legend. Then came the unexpected. She invited Cecilia to share her story with all the students at a special conservatory event. A simple yet powerful gesture, as if finally realizing that wisdom wears no uniform. And that's how the world changes. Not with cold speeches or bureaucratic handbooks, but through moments that shake the soul. When someone forces us to re-examine what we believed was true, that classroom would never be the same again. And the most amazing part? Everything had been recorded by one of the students. Not to mock her, as some feared at first, but to show that sometimes the most important lesson isn't in the syllabus, but in the living example of someone the world once forgot. The very next day, the video had already spread across the internet. It was impossible to watch without getting chills. The footage captured not only an impeccable performance, but the quiet dismantling of prejudice. News outlets, cultural pages, and influencers began sharing that story, each with their own perspective, but all with the same sentiment. There was something powerful there. It wasn't just about music, it was about humanity. And when truth touches the heart, no algorithm can hold it back. Interview requests flooded in. Local newspapers, national stations, and even international networks wanted to hear from the woman who silenced prejudice with her own hands. Cecilia, with her usual humility, spoke more with her gaze than with words, and she always made one point clear. This isn't about me. It's about all those who were ignored before me, and those who still will be, unless we learn from these stories. A phrase that became a quote, a motto, a tattoo. It was more than viral. It was a mirror. And here's the key point. Why did that scene move so many people? Maybe because deep down, we've all been Cecilia at some point. Judged by appearance, dismissed because of age, labeled without a chance to respond. And when someone breaks that cycle with grace and strength, it shines a light that reveals far more than expected. The video became a spontaneous, public masterclass, impossible to ignore. And the conservatory, once a stage for mockery, was about to become a symbol of transformation. Days later, Cecilia returned to the conservatory, but this time, not as a visitor, nor a tested student. She returned as an honorary teacher, greeted with flowers, applause, and respect. It was surreal to see the same faces that once frowned now lit up with anticipation. The old lady they had underestimated now led a new kind of class, not with musical theory, but with presence, with truth, the kind of class you never forget. One of those stories that changes you, not through content, but through experience. Sitting beside students who had barely heard of Chopin, Cecilia shared more than sheet music. She shared episodes from her life. She spoke of tours, backstage chaos, the struggle of being a black woman and a pianist in elite European circles. She spoke with humor, with tenderness, and always circled back to one point. Technique can be taught, but it's the story behind each note that makes the difference. Students, once indifferent, leaned forward in their chairs trying to catch every word like a treasure. In that moment, a new culture began to bloom. Teachers listened more attentively. Students asked questions with a sparkle in their eyes. And the conservatory, so used to setting the rules, was now learning to listen. Cecilia wasn't there to scold or make speeches. She was there to be present, to show that sometimes Teaching is simply reminding people of who they are, and the stories that were born from that encounter were only beginning to multiply. The impact of Cecilia's presence went far beyond the applause. The director, visibly moved by everything that had happened, called an emergency meeting with the faculty. For the first time in a long time, the discussion wasn't just about pedagogy, it was about values. It was decided then and there. The conservatory needed to change from the inside. Courses on intergenerational respect, empathy, and diversity were introduced. And the most symbolic gesture? They used Cecilia's story as a starting point. It became a case study, a new reference. Some teachers resisted, of course. There are always those who dismiss it as nonsense. But all it took was one class with Cecilia for resistance to turn into admiration. The hallway conversations shifted. They no longer revolved around resumes. They started to include life journeys. Instead of comparing talent, they began to value stories. The stories became part of the curriculum, not just of students' personal lives. Music was still being taught, but now with a new tone, a new form of listening, a new soul. More than lessons, a new culture was created. One of the largest conservatories in the country began walking a path few institutions dare to take, that of institutional humility. Cecilia became a symbol, not because she imposed herself, but because she inspired. And the most beautiful part? The change came from within, not from outside pressure or fear of being canceled, but because people listened, felt, and chose to do things differently. And in this new atmosphere, something even more transformative was about to happen. The most unlikely thing happened. What once seemed incompatible with the academic world of a prestigious conservatory unfolded right before the eyes of those who had only ever taught sheet music. The very teachers who laughed at Cecilia began over time to seek her out for advice. Yes, that elderly woman with slow steps and simple clothes, once mistaken for an intrusive onlooker, had become a reference. The awkwardness turned into admiration. Prejudice gave way to silent reverence. And it wasn't just anyone. One of the first to mock her, the same man who sarcastically proposed the test with an almost impossible piece, was also the first to change publicly. In front of an entire class, he gathered the courage to apologize. His voice trembled, but the remorse was genuine. He said he had spent his life studying technique, scales, rhythm, and precision, but had forgotten to study the most important thing, people. Emotionally, he admitted that the episode had shaken him, and from then on, he would dedicate at least one class each term to forgotten musicians, women, black composers, marginalized artists. A simple gesture, but in that context, it became a lesson in humanity, one of those stories that leaves deeper marks than any grade on a final exam. Of course, this transformation didn't happen overnight. It took weeks of sidelong glances, awkward silences, and slow change, as all true growth does. But the signs were there, scattered in small gestures. A student who once avoided solos now performed with more confidence. A professor who once taught on autopilot started asking questions, started listening. The hallways, once full of vanity, became places of exchange, of sharing. What had been merely a music school began to turn into a school of listening. Even the school's mural changed. Once filled with portraits of European men in starched suits and names known only to those raised with access to classical traditions, it now made space for other stories. A centenarian samba singer from Bahia's countryside, a self-taught trumpeter from rural Maranhão, a blind conductor who taught through vibration, names that might never appear in textbooks, but now had a place of living memory. The conservatory, which once prided itself on tradition, began to understand that true tradition isn't about exclusion, it's about inclusion and evolution. And it all happened because one woman dared not to be silenced, because someone had the courage to be who she was, even when everything around her demanded she shrink. Cecilia didn't beg for respect. She simply existed with such dignity that the space was forced to transform. And in doing so, she inspired others to do the same. Students began to see new possibilities for themselves. No longer did they need a European surname or a childhood locked in expensive classrooms. Talent was now recognized for its essence, not its packaging. And how beautiful it is to see that cycle reverse. The woman who was once invisible was now an inspiration. The one who had been treated as a nuisance was now a source of wisdom. Cecilia wasn't seeking recognition. It was never about applause or accolades. She just wanted to accompany her granddaughter. But the truth is, her presence helped others recognize themselves. helped quiet young voices find their sound, helped proud teachers relearn how to learn. That's true teaching, the kind that doesn't end with a diploma but continues through daily gestures, exchanges, and actions. Teaching that doesn't stop at the classroom door, but echoes down the hallways of life. And right in the midst of it all stood a young woman with shining eyes, Cecilia's granddaughter, a witness to the silent revolution her grandmother had sparked. Not with shouts, not with confrontation, but simply by being. She watched the changes unfold, absorbed every detail, and understood she was witnessing something greater than any technique class. She was learning a lesson in courage, in authenticity, in resistance, because the greatest transformation wasn't just in the teachers, nor in the conservatory. It was happening inside her. Every chord now carried new meaning. Every note was filled with purpose. That young woman who once only wanted to learn to play the piano now wanted to make music a bridge, a channel for healing, for listening, for rebuilding. She realized that her grandmother had taught her more than scales. She had shown her the power of standing tall even when the world tries to push you to the margins. That's how great stories are born, not with fireworks, but with seeds planted in the soil of courage. Cecilia did become a symbol, but not because she sought the spotlight. She became a symbol because she touched truth with her own hands, and in doing so, she touched other lives as well. And you, who've read this far, have you ever stopped to think how many Cecilias you've overlooked in your life? How many talents you've ignored? How many times you chose to judge by appearance, by tone of voice, by worn-out clothes? Maybe it's time to look again, to truly listen again. Because sometimes what looks like just a grandmother accompanying her granddaughter is actually a living legend waiting to be heard. And more importantly, what will you do with this now? Will you keep judging by appearances, or will you begin to see with your heart? Because real change begins in how we choose to see others. And who knows, maybe like Cecilia, you also have a dormant talent inside, just waiting for one brave moment to bloom again. At the end of that unforgettable semester, Cecilia's granddaughter was invited to the stage to deliver a short speech. In the audience were teachers, students, parents, guest artists, and even members of the conservatory's board. The room held a different kind of energy, as if everyone there knew that something bigger than music had awakened over the past few months. The young woman walked hesitantly to the center of the stage. The microphone felt heavy in her trembling hands. She took a deep breath, looked at her grandmother sitting in the front row, and said, her voice cracking, "My grandmother taught me that gifts don't die, they just wait for the right moment to bloom again." Silence. Total silence. The kind that comes before tears, not of sadness but of deep understanding. The phrase, so simple, carried an ancestral power. It was more than a tribute. It was a manifesto, a reminder that talent isn't measured by age, appearance, or titles hanging on a wall. It was as if, in that instant, everyone in the room understood that true learning lies not in the sheet music, but in the courage to be authentic, to take up space, to resist the labels imposed on us. The granddaughter's words spread like wildfire through the conservatory's social networks. They became a quote on bulletin boards, in conversation circles, even in pages of local newspapers. What Cecilia represented went beyond music. It was the possibility of rebirth, of being seen, heard, and valued again in a world that insists on discarding what it doesn't immediately understand. It became one of those stories no one could ever forget. And to think it all began with a provocation disguised as a test. An arrogant, almost cynical remark from a professor who asked, "Would the lady like to try playing something since you seem so curious?" He could never have imagined he was speaking to a former soloist, an artist who had once moved entire European audiences, and who had left the stage for a reason few there would immediately understand: motherhood and the choice of a simpler life. But Cecilia didn't respond with anger. She didn't shout, didn't confront anyone. She simply smiled tenderly, walked over to the piano and let her fingers do the talking. When she finished playing the piece, one of the most complex in the classical repertoire, the entire room stood up. There was no pretending anymore that this woman was just a visitor. She was a living monument to everything art can be: resistance, beauty, memory, and courage. From that day on, her granddaughter saw music through new eyes. Before, she practiced out of obligation. Now she played as if giving something back to the world. Every note was a love letter to her grandmother. Every rehearsal, a tribute. What was once technique became homage. What was once doubt became mission. Cecilia had awakened in her not just a passion, but a purpose. In the conservatory's hallways, Cecilia's presence became symbolic. Students sought her out during breaks, asking for advice. Professors began rethinking their attitudes. Even the most traditional members of the administration, who initially treated the episode with discomfort, started defending the idea of bringing diverse voices into music education. Gradually, without waving flags, Cecilia began a silent revolution, the kind she had already learned to lead with elegance and patience years earlier, behind the scenes of life. Today, Cecilia continues as a guest professor. She never asked for the position, never demanded any recognition. Yet her class became one of the most sought after, not because she offers the best techniques, but because she offers listening. She understands that an artist's greatest gift isn't only in their fingers, but in their soul. And those who pass through her class leave not only with annotated scores, but with the certainty that they carry a story inside them worth telling. She became a bridge between past and present, between hidden talent and deserved recognition, between those who were ignored and those who need to learn to see better. Her story crossed generations, and now her granddaughter, a graduate, carries Cecilia's name on stages across the country. She always begins her concerts with a short statement. Today, I play for all the voices that were once silenced. Cecilia watches it all with teary eyes, but without vanity. What she feels is gratitude for choosing the hardest but truest path, gratitude for never giving up on herself, even when the world said it was too late, gratitude for turning humiliation into strength, a test into a lesson, pain into a bridge, and most of all, gratitude for watching her granddaughter bloom, not as a copy but as a continuation. And that's why some stories don't end. They echo. They're passed hand to hand, generation to generation. They touch more than instruments. They touch lives. And like Cecilia's, they keep being written in every act of courage, every sincere chord, every gaze that refuses to judge by appearances and chooses to listen with an open heart. Because in the end, it's not technique that changes the world. It's sensitivity. It's empathy. It's the power of a story told at the right moment and heard with an open heart. Now tell me, how many times have you looked down on someone just because of the clothes they were wearing? How many times did you fail to greet, to listen, to give someone a chance, just because they didn't seem to fit your circle? The truth is, we were taught from a young age to judge a book by its cover, to measure worth by the shine of clothes, the brand of the watch, the haircut, or even the tone of voice. And in doing so, how many silent talents have we let slip by? How many incredible stories remained invisible just because the packaging didn't seem right? Maybe it's time to stop measuring others with a crooked ruler, the ruler of our own biases. Because some people carry entire worlds in their eyes, have fought battles you can't imagine, have won internal wars just to smile in the morning. Some walk in silence but leave trails of light behind. And just because they didn't show up dressed the way you expected, you dismissed them. You didn't realize that behind that ordinary face lived a legend, a story, ready to teach you what no book ever could. That's exactly what happened with Cecilia, a seemingly ordinary lady, the kind you'd see on the bus at the market, sitting on a park bench reading the paper. Simple clothes, serene look, slow steps. Most people there thought she was just the student's grandmother. Others assumed she was some conservatory employee. But no one imagined that this quiet woman had once captivated entire audiences in Europe, earning standing ovations in historic concert halls. Cecilia was pure music, and she was there just to accompany her granddaughter. Or at least that's what everyone thought. When the professors mockingly challenged her to play one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, they thought they were just being funny. A test. A provocation disguised as a joke. What they didn't know was that they had just handed the stage to one of the greatest pianists of her generation, and when Cecilia placed her hands on the keys, time stood still, laughter turned into silence, prejudice melted away, note by note, and in that moment the conservatory lived one of its greatest stories. Life has a funny way of teaching. Sometimes the lesson doesn't come with harsh words or fiery speeches. Sometimes it comes through a gesture, a sound, a presence that by itself becomes a mirror and sparks reflection. Cecilia didn't raise her voice. She didn't give a speech. She simply played with her soul, with her story, with the years she spent away from the stage to raise her children, to care for her family, to become invisible to the world, yet a giant to those who truly knew her. And in that moment, something changed. In the conservatory, in the teachers, in the students, in her granddaughter, even in those who later watched the video that went viral. Because when a story like this shows up, it doesn't knock on your door. It storms in. It breaks through to say, wake up. There's something you're not seeing. There are people you're underestimating. And the hardest truth of all, there's talent inside you that you allowed to fall asleep because you believed what they told you, because you accepted the label they put on you, because someone once made you think you weren't enough. But let me tell you something. You are, even if you've forgotten, even if you've walked away from your gift, even if you've stayed silent for years. There's still time to play your own music. There's still time to write your own stories. Cecilia proved that, and she didn't do it with arrogance, she did it with grace, with courage, with soul, with art, because some things can only be taught by example, and some truths can only be expressed with such power by those who've been underestimated. Maybe the greatest legacy of this story isn't even the music she played, nor the video that traveled the world. Maybe the most important part is the discomfort it caused, the urge to see differently, the awareness that we must stop validating only those who show up with a fancy badge, a polished resume, or dressed for the red carpet. The most beautiful stories, I know, came from people who had no spotlight, but carried truth. And when truth appears, it can't be ignored for long. So I ask you again, what will you do with this now? Will you keep judging by appearances? Keep reproducing the same patterns, the same filters, the same prejudices disguised as common sense? Or will you finally start truly listening? Because listening isn't just hearing. It's making space. It's welcoming. It's allowing someone else's story to pass through you and transform you. And that, my friend, is how we grow. Maybe, just like Cecilia, you also have a sleeping talent inside you. A gift you locked away out of fear, shame, or lack of opportunity. Maybe all you need is a small act of courage, a first step, a piano waiting for you, an inner audience that, instead of judging you, embraces you. Because when we stop hiding and show up with everything we are, the world changes, and the most beautiful stories come to life. And if this story moved you, if something inside you stirred while hearing all this, here's what you can do. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, share this with someone who needs to hear it, because the stories that truly change the world and are the ones we choose to tell. And every time you share, you plant a seed, a new perspective, a new chance, a new beginning. And honestly, we could really use more beginnings like that.